Hello. Everybody, hi. Wow, what a crowd tonight. I'm thrilled to see how many of you have come tonight. It's really so great, so fantastic. Welcome to our evening of iMusic. Welcome. Oh, music? Not that kind, not what I was doing before, but music for the eyes. Music from our hands. Music that our eyes can receive with pleasure and joy. The iMusic Festival has me, I'm here for the iMusic Festival as your MC, and my name is Jack. Thank you. It's a great honor to be a part of this gathering because all the people I'm next to are amazing. The grandparents of poetry, world-famous lecturers, storytellers, poets. Sitting next to them is in itself an honor, but to be the MC and a part of this, and to be a part of recognizing our celebration is such a huge honor. When I looked at the words iMusic, I thought of Chuck Baird. One of his paintings, the piano, some of you are familiar with it, has keys with colors coming out of them. So you can see this pink spot, as if the key at the end that your pinky would touch is pink. It's all about being visual. I don't know if any of you who are deaf grew up with pianos. Yeah, 60s and 70s. Did too, eh? Yeah. I would put my hand, see, we're all having the same visceral memory. My teacher was hearing, my parents were hearing. They didn't get what was going on with me, so they sent me for piano classes. So I'd sit and I'd play piano, and my teacher would say, "Wonderful." And I would hit a sour note every once in a while and play to the best of my ability and feel the vibrations on the top of the piano. But internally, I had a sense of music and love of music. But that teacher needed to be my speech teacher. Oh, reminded me of my speech teacher. All speech teachers are exactly the same. They have curly-ish hair, they turn their heads to the side, they watch with a look of semi-satisfaction to non-satisfaction, as whatever I do. And that was the same thing with my piano playing. So Chuck Baird's painting, with all the beautiful paint and colors coming out of the piano, was precisely the image of how I feel about what music should be. That it emanates from within, that there's a rhythm of the signs, a rhythm of the movement, just like the rhythm that I was trying to create on the piano. The same kind of rhythm that people who can hear are enjoying with their ears, we're going to be enjoying tonight with our eyes. I'm very grateful to Larry Polansky, who's responsible for this wonderful event. With his entire team, who have pulled this thing together, this amazing festival. It's been going on Wednesday, Thursday, tonight, Friday, and then Saturday afternoon there'll be panels, and Saturday evening a performance. And I couldn't help, as I thought about this, to look back at my Gallaudet days when I was at the university, Gallaudet University. And I was a part of student government. And it was the first time that we set up something called Deaf Issues. Now, we're getting better, but we had a Deaf Issues Department, DID, and we were striving to have deaf studies and different things that recognized us as a culture and that looked at the world of deafness through deaf people's eyes, including the education of deaf children and so forth. And here we were, the center of attention, DID, and we had a week in the springtime called Deaf Lit Week. And people thought, well, it's a Gallaudet, so they have poetry and stories and lectures in ASL, but not so much. You would think that would be a commonplace thing, but not so much. Simultaneous communication where people were signing and talking at the same time, which sounds impossible and is, occurred constantly, because that was 1992, and Gallaudet, it wasn't a long time ago, but Gallaudet was not on top of that in terms of being ahead of the times. But we had a full house for this Deaf Lit Week, and we had wonderful people like MJ Bienvenu and William Stokey, who was the first to recognize, one of the first to recognize that American Sign Language is a language, and he came in at a very advanced age and shortly after died. Clayton Valley was there, the father of VRS. I shouldn't say VRS, I'm stuck with VRS. Video Relay Services. Have any of you used that before? Okay. So, never mind, that was a complete slip of the hand. He was an immensely powerful and important poet. In our time, we saw that, but this week is very similar to that. It really brings back those memories. And now I see a full house again. And it is so important that we value and cherish the contributions of deaf people, their stories, our music. That is the I music that we're here for. I feel about this the way I feel about the most important things in the world. This is very, very important. Tonight, we have an amazing lineup of poets, storytellers, actors, all in one night. Sometimes you get a little taste here and there, but tonight, we're getting it all. Like having a fabulous buffet with the best of possible foods, right? And you get to have everything. I'm delighted to start introducing our performers for this evening. Our first performer is Shira Grabelsky. Shira is an amazing person. She's an experimenting poet who thinks differently. She's produced, directed, acted, internationally, nationally, locally. She's been involved in Shakespeare as an ASL consultant. She had a role as Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker in Washington, D.C. at the Arena Stage. Amazing. Tonight, and I have to tell you on a personal level, I feel very privileged because we're friends. And I also want to tell you that she's an amazing woman. So I'm really thrilled to have her here tonight to share her poetry. Daybreak, of course, with Shira. Thank you. I didn't plan to say anything, but I just want to say a little something. It's been a fascinating process for me because I was determined to have no English involved in this whole process. So everything was edited on video and thought through on video without any writing or anything. So it's been an amazing process, which is the reason I said nobody was to put voice to this. And I may translate it someday, but perhaps into Spanish. Again, let's give her one more round of applause. That was amazing. The images. Another person is here. Thomas Holcomb, Dr. Thomas Holcomb. You have fans here. Tom is going to talk about 5 generations. He's very well known. He's traveled the world to speak on deaf education, deaf culture. He's written books. He's created DVDs about how deaf and hearing worlds can be bridged, how we can understand one another. I watch his DVDs all the time because I provide training for people who are not deaf. And I feel like I'm constantly using his examples for what are the characteristics of the cultures and communities that come together. I'm thrilled that he's going to talk to us tonight about 5 generations.
Hi everyone. It's a thrill to be here and to see so many folks out tonight. First, I have a very brief poem on this subject of many generations of deaf people in my family. Five generations. A family like a rainbow with stories and lives to tell. 5 deaf generations in my family. My grandparents were deaf. My parents were deaf. I am deaf. My children are deaf, although they're not children anymore. And my grandchildren are deaf. 5 generations of stories, all part of me and I part of them. Those are the stories I live to tell. So let me tell you something. My grandparents were both deaf, and they had wonderful stories. Every evening was story time with them. And I just wanted to pick one of theirs to share with you, one from each generation. And I'll tell you at the end why I picked each of them that I'll tell. So for my grandparents, each state had a school for the deaf, and that's where all the deaf students in that state would go. They were residential schools, which meant that they didn't go home every day. They didn't even go home on the weekends. Maybe on holidays at Christmas time, and definitely up in the fall and spring. So, my grandfather one time didn't go home for 7 years because it was just too expensive to make the trip, so he stayed there. Now, my grandmother was in North Carolina. The schools for the deaf, like the one in Morganton, tended to be near the train tracks. That's how students used to get there. Oddly enough, the school in Fremont is also near the train track, but not for the same reason. But so was the one in Riverside. Or so, I mean, there's the school at the seaside in Riverside. Anyway, the children would go by train to the school. They get dropped off. The train didn't normally stop at the school for the deaf, but it did at the beginning of the school year. It was a special stop they made so that all the kids could be unloaded before it would go on to the next scheduled stop. And then in the spring, you would make a special stop to load all the kids up and take them off to wherever they live. Many of the kids were at the school for the first time. Many of the kids were encountering language for the first time. They didn't have any to call their own when they got to school. Maybe they were 6, maybe they were 8, 9, 12, 13, 15. The whole range of ages had kids coming for the very first time. Of course, once they got to the school, it was a different matter. They'd meet kids who signed very well. Now, each of the kids, in order to be kept straight to know who was who, had a name tag, so that as soon as they got to the campus, they could be sent to the proper dorm. Now, they had their jackets. Most of them had heavy jackets with name tags pinned on them, but they get to school in North Carolina in August, and it's unbearably hot. And so before they get on the train, their parents dress them all up nice with their suit coats and ties, or their dresses and their outer coats, so they can be all very polite little adults when they get on the train with their name tags on their jackets. As soon as they're all on the train, all the jackets come off. They're splayed out trying to get cool on the train. And then as soon as they get near the school, they're all in a mad dash to get their appropriate clothing back on, so that they'll be able to go where they're supposed to go. And then the school personnel send Bill where he's supposed to go and Susie where she's supposed to go. Of course, you also use their name tags as a chance to teach them how to speak their names. They would also send reports about, say, if one of the children had an injury or had a high fever. Parents would get frequent reports about how well their kids were doing. And then when it was time to go home, the parents were looking forward to how well their children could speak, because they had been given such wonderful feedback throughout the year. They expected a miracle had occurred. And when the children got home, the parents couldn't wait to hear little Billy say his name. And so with great effort, the little child would say, "My name is Bob." No, his name was Bob. Because the kids had gotten their jackets mixed up when they got to school early in the year, and they were called whatever name was on whatever jacket they had thrown on before they got off the train. They spent a year drilling how to pronounce a name that wasn't theirs. So it took, the parents quickly got on them to undo all of that and try to teach them how to say what their name really was. That was my favorite story from my grandparents. Now, a story from my mom. I have an older brother. And my mother had 24-hour labor in bringing him into the world. I was surprised so many years later. But why was it exactly 24 hours? My mother told me that she went into the hospital and there was this big ward with all the women in beds all lined up in the room, and my father stayed out in the hallway. There wasn't any team in there for support. She was in there all by herself, and a deaf woman at that. And it was the worst experience of her life. The nurse on duty, when she first arrived, was just out and out mean. She couldn't stand the fact that she had to take care of a deaf patient, and she was very bossy. And my mother was in great pain. It's a very long labor, and of course she was groaning and moaning, and the woman would come over to her and tell her to keep quiet. How are you going to tell a deaf woman in labor to keep quiet? It was a really awful experience for her. Middle of the night, the shift changed, and she got a nice nurse who was very comforting, and my mother felt a lot better. But then it came time for another change of shift. And again, a friendly nurse was on duty. But then during the 24 hours, she had several shift changes until it came back time again to have that same meeting person. As soon as that meeting was arrived, my mom said, okay, that doesn't have to be. And the baby came very soon thereafter. My oldest daughter, Tara, we were in New York. Many of you are from New York, some from Rochester as well, where we used to live. A lot of old friends here, which is, of course, great to see. I was there for 9 years. Well, the thing that bothered me the most is that cold light stuff that would come down from the sky, starting in October all the way through May. And it was odd thing, it seemed to happen every year. I was a California boy, so I did my best, but I couldn't take it, so I came back. What do you call that stuff? Something or other. Anyway, we were in Rochester. We finally bought our dream home out in the country, which we could never afford here in California, but it was this huge estate, what it felt like. Lots of room. And this was in the summertime. And we thought we'd stay forever. Maybe we wouldn't have if we moved in the wintertime, but we moved in the summertime. Then we had a big open house when we moved in, bring in our friends, people from work. Maybe some of you were even there. And our friends included both hearing and deaf people, and everybody was there having a great time. And then I saw my daughter, Tara, in a mood, stomping around, looking for her. She had something important to write, and what she had written was a sign that said, "Deaf only allowed." She got some tape out too, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "This is going up on my room, my bedroom door. So many people have been marching into my room, not signing, just flapping their lips, not signing. And I felt like a stranger in my own room." I said, "Does that mean your cousin can't go into your room?" "Oh no, my cousin can. She can sign." So in her world, although she might have thought in terms of deaf and hearing, what she really meant were people who could sign and people who couldn't. That was the dividing line. And she said, "I may have to take it other places, but not in my room." So she was, and to this day, is a very strong individual. Now, my grandson. I'd have to adjust how I signed his height because he's a growing boy. He went to visit Disneyland and had a great time and had stories to tell when he came back. And I forget which character it was, and he said, "One of them could sign." And I said, "That's great." And he said, "But the other ones didn't. What's wrong with that? They should all be able to sign. One isn't enough. What's wrong with the other ones? They're not what I expected." I think it's great that he had that expectation. And so these stories show just how much times have changed. From when there was no communication access and that was sort of accepted, where people may finally find their way to sign language and it saves their life because there was so little chance of them getting to it, and from a time when there was very little availability of sign language, let alone professional interpreting in places like hospitals, to a time when my daughter Tara could expect that people coming into her territory would sign, and if they didn't, well, they could just turn themselves around and out the screen door hit them. And then to my grandson, again, who expected that signing was the norm. I love to see that progression, a historical progression of our society reflected in my family. And now we see so many people, hearing people interested in learning sign language and learning about our world. I appreciate that so much. Thank you and good night.
Beautifully said. Speaking of the 5 generations in your family, we have to capture that on film. We've got to document that. Those comments like that have to be recorded for posterity. Now, see other people in the audience saying, yes, indeed, it's got to be recorded. We do have an individual here, Dr. Patty Ladd. The author of the Deathhood text and the grandfather of the concept. I'm not sure how old I should make him. But he was the one who authored this text about his journey and discoveries. He is the one who said to us, it's important for us to document these realizations, whether we think they're important or not. They have got to be recorded in video, visually. We have to constantly remind ourselves that we've got to record these beautiful moments. So thank you for that, Tom. Next, I would like to introduce Karen Christie. We refer to her as Casey. Comes from Rochester. Well, actually, she was from here and then relocated to Rochester, where she stayed a large number of years with those funny white things that would float down from the sky. She suffered through it. And when she got here the other day, she said, oh, Peter, are you still processing the experience you're having? It's still a moment, but she's still processing the relief coming to our environments here. She's retired professor at NTID. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read all of the bios that were on the website, but if you think about it, we have an awful lot of Rogestarians here. We have Tom, I forgot, Tom and Patrick and Karen, members from NTID and other people in the audience, Kenny and Peter. Oh, he's emphasizing that it was Chicago. He used to have a longer ponytail. His signing used to be like this, and now we have to retract the downward movement of the ponytail. So we should have enough syllables here. Getting back to Karen. As I mentioned, she's a retired professor, and she was very interested in deaf culture, ASL, specifically ASL literature, and more specifically poetry. And she did author many journals and has documented an awful lot of work on ASL poetry. And was one of the ones to discuss the difference between the sign that we as deaf people came up with for poetry, which is a signed expression, as opposed to poetry, which refers to the way that hearing people will record poetry, mostly in print. So she was the one who made that distinction for us, the difference between speaking and writing poetry and signing expressions of poetry. Her latest publication is online. You can get that by subscribing to the website. It's The Heart of Deaf Culture, Literacy, and Artistic Expression of Deafhood. And with deafhood, we're talking about the journey that we as deaf people take in discovering our identity and feeling good about ourselves as deaf people, and emanate those positive vibes and develop positive relationships. She has 2 films that she'll be showing, one of them that has to do with a poem, and she would like you to look at it and maybe do a little bit of analyzing the poem and have a discussion about that. And the other is a tribute to Betty G. Miller, who we know was a profound artist. So she'll be showing you both those films. Sit back and enjoy and return.
Hello. Hello. All the way back there, wow. Quite a crowd. I'm very happy and honored to be involved in this festival. A lot of people have escaped from Rochester. I think we've come specifically to get away from the cold, or at least that's been a big side benefit. It's a great honor to be involved in this event. Tom's story about 5 generations was very impressive. I came from a family where nobody signed. My parents could hear, they weren't deaf. And I experienced poetry, meaning English poetry. That was my first exposure. And later, as I learned ASL, I fell madly in love with ASL poetry. I have fallen even more deeply in love with it as I've as I have analyzed and studied ASL poetry. And I've written poetry, and I think about how can I share with people this new and different way. And the way that I've done that is working with another woman from Rochester, New York, named Dorothy Wilkins. Dorothy and I have worked together on a project with poetry, written poetry, English poetry, becoming ASL poetry. So I write it, we negotiate how to sign it, and then she performs it, and I videotape it, edit it, and create something that will allow us to really take advantage of the visual nature of American Sign Language. The first poem is called Daybreak in Old Hartford. It's a there's a very famous black man named Langston Hughes who wrote a very famous poem called Daybreak in Alabama. We had the idea of creating something that would speak to the issue of black, and he had the idea of something that would speak to the issue of black and white people getting along, connecting. And we thought, in our approach, that we would do Daybreak in Old Hartford, because that was where the first school for the deaf was. That was the number one first school for the deaf. When I get to be a smooth signer, I'm gonna sign some poems about daybreak in Old Hartford. And I'm gonna use some of the pure, old ASD signs spreading across the sky like the branches of an old oak tree. I'm gonna sign about scads and scads of dandelions and their fluff floating on the slow breezes. And show how spring smells drift with long, reaching arms, and calm, peaceful face. And there's a field of daisy eyes, of deaf and hearing, deaf, hearing, deaf people all watching. And I'm gonna grasp hearing hands and deaf hands and baby hands, and coda hands, and Claire and Gallaudet hands, Alice hands, all joining in, tapping fingers on shoulders, and reaching out to each other, natural as vines, in that misty dawn of poetry, when I get to be a smooth signer and compose a poem about daybreak in Old Hartford. That's okay. That's okay. I just want to introduce the next one before we go ahead. That was an experiment. We were playing around, roughly playing with film and poetry. The next one is a poem about Betty G. Miller. Many of you know who Betty was. She was an amazing woman. An artist. And in the 70s, along with some other people, she set up a deaf artist colony. Can you imagine that? In Austin, Texas. Later, she called deaf artists together to talk about the work, to share their art, and to work together. And then she decided to write a manifesto about new art called De Via, Deaf View Art of Art. DE is deaf, V is view, I is image, and A is art. De Via. We have recently celebrated the 25th anniversary of the founding of De Via. And we're very sad to have seen her death 2 years ago, but we want to honor her at this event and celebrate the 25 years of her contribution. So I'm going to show this film, and at the same time you'll see her last piece of artwork that she left in the studio when she died. It has stayed there. It's purple and orange. Her partner didn't go into the studio until later, and when she went in, she saw that. So it's very nice, a great honor to allow us to include that here. So we're honoring Betty G. Miller here. You have dress canvases filled with your life. Black and white. Filled as Betty G with colors. Canvases filled with light. The neons your life, colors, and light. Filled our eyes to overflowing. Now, we are left with empty canvases. Yet these blank canvases you bequeath to each deaf artist today. Signing softly, come, come, come. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. That was just beautiful. Now you see, with this recent video, what was the thing you noticed? What did you notice? 3 times. Everything was signed 3 times. The pattern that created the poetry. That's what I mean by I. That's the deaf version of music. I felt myself moving to the rhythm of those poems. And we have, I'm honored to be a part of honoring Betty G. Miller. She had a huge influence on our lives and on our deafhood journey. She was way ahead of her times. You can find more about her on the internet, and I encourage you to do so. She's worthy of your study. Here's to Betty G. Miller. Thank you so much for showing us those films. Next, we're set for the next opportunity. I'm very pleased to introduce Ella Mae Lentz. She has made a huge contribution. She's the mother, the grandmother, the godmother, the sister of deaf poetry. And her work is so beautiful, and she has created so many pieces of work, so many DVDs, so many beautiful poems. And now she's working very hard on a national signing curriculum, the Signing Natural curriculum. You think she's done, you think she's retired, but no, she's not. She has created new editions, she's improved on it, because she sees how you all value signing naturally, and she wants you to do even better with it. So she's still committed to creating wonderful curricula for sign language learning. And she's involved in the Deaf Hood Foundation. She's the organizing chair, terribly committed to equality in this world, so that deaf people can feel free as deaf people with no sense of stigma. And now I want to bring to the stage a beautiful poet, Ella Lentz.
You know, I was reading pages 2 through 7 in Patty Ladd's book. In it, he describes metaphors. And I read it for a while and eventually fell asleep. But everything I read was invading my dreams, strongly influenced what I was thinking. a museum, very, not quite similar to what we have here, a lot more ornate than what we have here. But in that museum, there was signage that talked about deafness. And interesting, that suffix we use for NASS also looks a lot like the sign we use to bury something. A stately building with huge staircase, circular rotunda rooms with these marble columns. And my job was to clean the museum, to dust and polish, which I did faithfully every week. Now I noticed in one corner of the museum, there were all these accoutrements for fixing deaf people's ears. The ear trumpets that would, of course, help someone to hear. There were these hats with flowers, but unbeknownst to you was this device that would bring in sound and carefully, in a very disguising way, put amplified sound into your ear. Then there was the huge body aids that people would wear, a foot square that was strapped to your chest, which got smaller with time, and eventually we had very tiny pocket-sized hearing aids, which evolved into the over-the-ear aid, and then now the tiny earbuds. Next to that, there were shelves dedicated to cochlear implants and very colorful disguises and neon colors of purple and yellow, and which used to be a huge device which was strapped to your belt and eventually evolved in a very small device that you carefully hang on the back of your head. There was a doctor in a lab coat, and one after the other, these doctors were standing there in their lab coats. I didn't know any of their names, never committed them to memory, but they were responsible for performing thousands of surgeries on deaf children. I didn't know who they were. It wasn't important to me. My job was just to clean and polish and dust. Not far from there was a room where they taught speech and a lot of the tools and devices. Those glass domes that they used to have that you would push a button and it would have a cow's tongue that would make noise. If you wanted to pronounce the letter A, it would show you how to retract the tongue. And if you wanted to make the sound of the vowel E, you would have to make your tongue follow the shape of the cow's tongue, which I polished the glass dome as I was supposed to do. Then there were these other shelves with all kinds of devices, look like headsets and microphones, apparently, where somebody would speak into the microphone and somebody would adjust the amplitude and maybe crank up the decibels so the deaf person's eyes would roll in their head. And, these other kinds of devices. What a cold and sterile room that was. But I cleaned it beautifully. And then something got my attention and said, "Seek out the door in the back." I said, "Well, I've been working here all these years. I never knew of a secret door in the back." But curiosity got the better of me. So I walked towards the door in the back. And sure enough, on this wall, you could see the outline of a door frame, which was invisible to me for all these years. On the door was a sign, almost unable to be read. It was so dim, subtle, it said deaf culture. When I went in, it smelled like an old, musty museum, something that had been left and abandoned for all these years. I flipped the switch and the lights came to life. And it lit up this bright room. Beautiful sculptures, carved wood, sculptures that were made by deaf children in the schools for the deaf. I was moved to see such beautiful pieces of art compared to the scientific devices of the previous rooms. But the beautiful paintings were turned with their backs towards me. You couldn't see the canvas. I turned one over. It was the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, who paid tribute to deaf people and cherished the language that they used, the sign language. There were people, the sultans, who employed deaf people in their palace, in their court. I'm talking about the 1600s. Turned over another painting to reveal Europe, kings and princes of Spain and France and England, who would bring deaf people into their court and valued their sign language, never made fun of them as if they were acting like animals. I turned over another to show Queen Elizabeth, who was using the two-handed alphabet with a deaf child. Amazing! All these discoveries. Another painting of Martha's Vineyard, where deaf and hearing people alike using sign language. I couldn't believe all the inspiration that was before me. All of this taking place in the 1600s, 1700s, and before. When I looked around the room further, I saw that there were shelves of books and films and videos, and a particular shelf caught my interest. It had a label, Deaf Teachers. It looks like they had archived all these books. And I guess when we had the age of oralism and all the deaf teachers were fired from the schools for the deaf, they had a way of preserving their lessons, as Jack has admonished us today. We must document our history and our education. And here they were in the museum. One of them said, Travels with Mouths, the next generation. Mouths. That's Eric Malzacoon. He was a teacher of the deaf. He taught at a school for the deaf. He attended a school for the deaf, California School for the Deaf, to be specific. And he was very creative. He loved theater, drama, poetry. He was one of the individuals instrumental for the founding of the National Theater of the Deaf. Inside this packet was a film, which I loaded onto the ancient projector. And this is the story that I saw. Years ago, we'd go down the hallways of the school, and over one threshold we saw a Malzacoon. On entering the doorway, we were locked into a chamber, and we'd take our seats, strapped in on the blackboard in front of us. It would pivot around, and its place would be a bank of flashing lights and gears and toggles and switches. Then there was the countdown, and we could feel the rumble as the engines started to roar, and we were off, traveling through space. Mouths, you always told us stories, creative, finding your ways to wind through every genre of life and poetry. And in our travels, we'd also see books and their place. And you would take us there. You'd send us on this journey to land in the world of books spread out before us. And you'd have us gather the books, pile them pound by pound into our space vessels, stacking them so high that we were concerned that we'd never make the trip back home. And you told us not to worry, that we could climb in and you would get the motor started again, and sure enough, the jets would fire and we would start our journey back home. And you exposed us to the world of words. You more or less taped them to us so that we could never forget them, affix them to our minds and our hearts. How we enjoyed your stories and your creativity and the places that you would take us. Eventually, the spaceship would land back home. And before we knew it, the class period was over. What a trip. That's right. What a wonderful teacher Eric Malzacoon was. What a wonderful experience he gave to us. I cast my glance to another shelf that was labeled Deaf Poets. And of course, being curious, I had to find what was on that shelf. And one of them was about Dorothy Miles, who is also gone now, no longer with us. At first, she was interested in English written poems that she would translate into sign language. And upon her passing, we have suffered such a great loss. I decided to view the film to a deaf woman. And now you're gone. Your physical presence is fading from us, never to be seen again. But as I gaze at the moon, instead what I see is the lemons that you would squeeze, and the drops would trickle down into the water, and it would shimmer. As I gaze into the sky, I see clouds, but what I really see is your imagination, how you would encourage us to see these animals and different shapes and beings in the clouds. As I gaze into the rain, instead what I see are your tears of grief and depression. I gaze into a garden of blooming flowers, but what I really see is the inspiration, the encouragement you gave us to grow. As I look into the sunrise and see the light appear on the dawn horizon, I think about your peace now. Your poem about the elephant breaking free of its chains, being able to run free. The poem about no longer being a hypocrite, but being able to stand true to who you are. And your freedom, your wings that you will use to take you far and away to your place of peace. Deaf children, this globe that you have given them, this freedom to express themselves, to play with signs like boats splashing on a river, ripples emanating into each of our lives, giving us the freedom to express ourselves in sign. Thank you, Dani. I miss you so much. I carefully put the film back on the shelf and once more gazed around the room. There's a picture that caught my eye up in the corner, and it was a hearing person. And then I looked at the other pictures that I had seen of hearing people. And these are people who are allies and supporters of deaf people and proponents of their rights. On the table, I saw some notes that were not finished. And it was the words iMusic. Those two words did not make sense to me together at first. And then I realized that that was the title of the poem. I wanted to find the poem. Now this was years ago, so I needed to find the VHS of the poem iMusic. You see the lines of the telephone poles dancing across the sky, creating an image much akin to iMusic, not to be listened to with the ears, not musical instruments to be played and listened to, but to be watched. The eyes can become the musical instruments. The telephone poles passing by hammer out a beat, as do drumsticks. Looking at sheet music with all the different scales, it reminds me of lines in space, creating linear pictures that inspire the heart and mind. But what goes on inside those lines up there on the telephone pole? Is that how phone conversations travel? I just don't understand. Ear music, eye music. Just as Jack commented, there are an awful lot of creative possibilities before us today. ASL poetry, music that is composed after the ASL poetry rather than the other way around. And you know, when I looked at those pictures on the wall, some of them were pointing in a particular direction. So I followed their gaze and their point, and I found another door. And to open up a closet to another door, which led me outside. Obviously had been a passageway at one point, but it was overgrown with weeds and almost impossible to walk on these days. But in the distance, I saw a figure. And that figure had a look of hope, a look that wanted to tell us something. Now this is what he said. Deafhood vision for a world. Where being born deaf is celebrated. And not condemned. A deafhood vision for a world where academic excellence in sign language is critical. And never compromise. A deafhood vision for the world, where deaf-related concerns are heard and never ignored. A deafhood vision for a world where natural diversity is embraced. And false divisions are discarded. Embrace deafhood now, so that our future generations can dream big, can think deep, can sign freely, and walk proudly as deaf people. With that, the spirit disappeared. But in following that spirit, I walked into this beautiful room, very ornately decorated, with things I had never seen before. Not deafness, deafhood. This was the original museum. I had gone in the wrong door. That sterile marble building that annexed our lives. Now this got me thinking more deeply about what all this symbolized. And I came to the realization that many of us were never really told much about deafhood. We you're told so much about what it means to hear and speak. We have got to change our focus now, to embrace our signing, to celebrate who we are as deaf people. Maybe you notice I have this blue ribbon on my lapel here. That reminds me. In Lentz book, he wrote, "To wear the blue ribbon is to pledge yourself, not only to the memory of those who have suffered, including those hearing people who are lost and struggled, to commemorate them, but also for those who still suffer today, our children who are confused about who they are, who don't have a solid identity. And by wearing this ribbon, it's to pledge yourself to fight, to end that oppression now for all the world's deaf children and others still to come. I pledge, and you should as well."
Wow. Wow. Ella Lentz. It's such an honor and a privilege to work with Ella. She's the producer of Deafhood Monologues, and she's also the director for that play. So we've worked together since the very beginning in 2006, writing, collaborating, gathering stories that represent the deaf experience. And we have found that regardless of where you look in the world, whether the deaf person has hearing family or a deaf family, still, they share this fundamental deaf experience. And we gathered those stories to create Deafhood Monologues, and now it's started to pop up all over, and it's really been quite a phenomenon. It's very important, the image of that museum, how deafness has changed. And now we're taking our deafhood back. Thank you, that's a perfect theme for this evening. Those telephone lines that represent the lines of music, the vision of eye music. Now I introduce Patrick Graybill. I must say, the Patrick Graybill. He's an amazing man. You are very, very lucky to have him here with us this evening and to have the opportunity to watch him. It's amazing. He's still around, he's still telling his stories, and I am thrilled. I'm like looking at him and thinking, it's like candy. It's so delicious to watch him, and I don't mean chocolate. I mean hard candy, because it's slow and lasting. He's an amazing, he's an actor, a writer, a translator between English and ASL, a poet. When I said the grandfather of DRS, what I really meant to say was the grandfather of ASL poetry, Patrick Graybill. He's taught at NTID for 23 years as a performing arts professor. He's retired. And his life is fascinating. He became a deacon in the church, and he has done that for 32 years and just retired. And he still performs, he still writes, he still translates, and he still works on new poetry to this day. So we're thrilled to have him come. He's going to talk about some reflections regarding poetry and storytelling. Welcome, a very warm welcome to the Patrick Graybill.
I'm really happy to be here tonight. People have called me a grandfather of this and that for a while now, and I don't quite know how to take that. Some of you may know Teresa Smith. She introduced me as a grandfather of something when I was 50. I was not ready for that. Now, I'm a little more ready for it. Starting with Shira this evening. And progressing through all of the other folks who are on the bill this evening, I just can't believe what a wonderful example of our history we're seeing. Very moving to me. Excuse me. Let's see if I can try to channel Shira here. Do I look like granddad now? Is it better if I stand? Okay, I can do that. Sight lines are important, and if I sit down, there's someone who won't be able to see me. And I know how it's like, what it's like to be a deaf audience member, so I will stand up for you. I'm 75 now. When I was younger, let's see, when was it? It was in 1988, I believe. The last week of my mother's life, and she was really thinking of her last few days now. She had CHF, chronic heart failure, and that's where the body just fills up with water. And her brain was only getting 10% of the oxygen that it needed. She was bedridden, and my siblings were keeping an eye on her because they knew that she didn't have much time left. Our mother never signed very well. She signed a little bit. Because I had older deaf sisters. And she saw how happy signing made them. And she sent them to the school for the deaf thinking that they ought to be taught speech, not signing. But then, when I was born 10 years later, she knew better, having seen what my sisters went through. And so she picked up some signs, not never really fluent, but we loved her for that. So during her final days, she wasn't signing at all anymore. She wasn't really speaking either, except for one word, which she said over and over. Good. If she had a little bit of ice to make her mouth feel better, she would say good. My sisters gave her a bath, she would say good. But that was the last word that she said just before she passed. And now, at the age of 75, I look back, of course. And yes, there have been a lot of bad things that have happened to me. But I think about what I want to happen to me in my remaining years. And I would like to be like my mother. I would like the last words that sum up my life to be good. And that's certainly how I'm feeling after what I've seen tonight. Very, very good. Don't you agree? Wow. as Jack said, I've done a lot in my life. I think that the work that I've produced has mostly come naturally for me. I haven't aspired to be like anyone else. I think that I'm a natural ham. I've been a bit of the actor all my life. And what I'd like to share with you now is this children's book. It was written in English for English-speaking children, hearing children. And it's called Fireflies. I grew up in Kansas, so I know from fireflies, they were everywhere. I like this little book. And as I thought about the character of the little boy, who in the book is written, not specifically as, but he is a hearing kid, I thought of him as a little deaf boy. And I thought of the whole story in terms of a deaf boy's eyes. And I just think it's a perfect story for that, and I'd like to share it with you. Not much to do on a summer night. Dinner doesn't taste like much. So I look out the big window, watch the sun going down. Over by the tree, I see the treehouse that my dad built for me, but it's getting too dark. I'm not quite brave enough to go out in the treehouse now. But then I see these little flickering lights. They come and go really quickly. I see one by the tree. There it is, but then it's gone. I see one by the fence. There it is, but then it's gone. But they're fireflies. I start to sign, firefly. But my mother taps me and says, "You're leaving your food, it's getting cold. It's just meat, potatoes, and corn." Fireflies. So it's gone in a jiffy. And I say, "Can I go out and play now, Mom? I want to play with the fireflies." She smiles. She looks to Dad, he looks to her, and they both nod. And shoo me out the door. So I'm away from the table, and a flash and out the door I go. But I forgot the jar. You gotta have a jar. I knew we had them down in the basement, so I went down and got myself a jar off the shelf. Had to pick just the right one. It was covered in dust, but I got rid of that real quick. Ran back upstairs, bounded through the kitchen, and realized that, oh, well, fireflies need air. So then I had to tiptoe up to my parents' bedroom to get the scissors and pound holes through the lid on the jar. Now I was ready. I ran downstairs, pushed open the screen door, and let it slam behind me. I didn't care how loud our sound it was, I'm deaf. And I ran down the hill. I had friends that lived all in the neighborhood, and they all had their jars too. Everybody wanted to catch fireflies. No matter how many caught, they caught. There were more of them to catch. We stayed until well after it was night, until the moon was out and the stars were all around the sky, sparkling just like the fireflies. And we were all proud of having caught more flies than the other in our jars. They lit up those jars practically white like the moon. Everybody wanted to catch more. We never had enough. It was glowing, the jar glowed so bright. Everybody had these bright white glowing jars. But then I was aware of a light flashing behind me, and it was a light in our house. My dad was calling me in to go to bed. I had to say goodbye to my friends and go up into the house. Climbed up the stairs to my bedroom and put my jar full of fireflies on my nightstand. Quickly got into my PJs, tucked myself in. My mom came in and kissed me goodnight. I showed her how many fireflies I caught. Dad stuck his head in to say goodnight, and I said, Dad, look how many I caught. Mom turned out the light and closed the door, and it was dark, except for my jar of fireflies, white glowing fireflies. One by one, though, I saw them fall to the bottom of the jar. Their beautiful glowing white color turned yellow as one by one they died. I couldn't watch them die. They were mine. They were my fireflies. I pulled a blanket over my head so I didn't see it happening. I jumped out of bed, took the jar, opened up the window where the moon was still shining and the stars were still sparkling. I opened up the jar to try to get them to fly free, and the ones that were still alive came back to life, went from green back to yellow, back to white, and out they went into the night. They joined the stars in lighting up the sky. My jar was not bright white anymore. My jar had turned dark. But the moon, the stars, and the fireflies kept the night bright. My sadness turned back to joy. Why do you think I like this so much? It's a mirror. It mirrors the death experience. We're sort of like fireflies. There are people who like to capture us and keep us on a shelf for display. But that's a form of oppression that we've all experienced. I created this when I was about 50. You do the math, how long ago that was. 25? Good for you. You all get an A+ on that. Well, a 100. Okay, let's give you a 100. Now, I created a poem called Fireflies that had nothing to do with actual fireflies, but it plays with this movement of the hand, the change of the hand shape. The title is Fireflies. There will be no interpretation. So, I'm the grandfather of this, that, and the other. I've never been married. But I have a lot of grandchildren. By that I mean the poems I named. like to go and visit them sometimes. It's good for me to visit those old grandchildren. See if they still feel true to me. One poem that I created a very long time ago. And I created it from the experience that I see coming up in some of the things we've seen this evening as well. It's called Liberation. As deaf people, we know the desire for liberation from the oppression that we experience. And it uses this handshake repeatedly throughout, and that's what you should look for without interpretation. I noticed that how speech is taught at schools for the deaf now is quite different. It often does incorporate sign language in order to teach, even if the subject is speech. That wasn't the case back in my day. That poem, it serves as a historical reminder of how things were and how they must never be again. The work that Karen has done has included categorizing poetry. And this one she would categorize as a poem of resistance. Another of my old poems that I'm about to share with you is from the time when I was studying English at Gallaudet University. Ella also studied English at Gallaudet, as did MJ Dani. There weren't that many choices, frankly, in our day of what to major in. And I thought that since I was one of the smart kids, of course I should study English. You know, what did I know? But everyone said, well, you're such a good performer, you're such a good storyteller, you know a lot about our history, you really ought to study English. So that's what I did. But there was an influence that came from Japanese haiku in my work. And of course, the haiku has very strict structure. 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. That's how it's created for a spoken language. And they usually convey the Japanese reverence for nature. So I labored over how I might create such a thing in sign language. It had to be brief, have some sort of formal structure, and I didn't know how to have that total 17 syllables since we never really knew what syllables were in sign language. I thought maybe movements could equal syllables. And for us, nature might not be the thing we revere so much as our schools for the deaf. And it also had to capture a snapshot because that's all that's all you can do in the short form of a haiku. So I have a few that I'll share with you tonight. This first one is called Memories. No interpretation. Just wanted to make sure that yes, indeed, I do prefer that the interpreter not voice while I'm doing my poems. Because you know you're hearing people, if there's something to hear, you'll listen to it. And I need your eyes open through creating visual poetry. Here's the next one. Number 3. And number 4. Now I'll share a new piece with you. But this isn't mine. This was from something that Karen Christie wrote, and I tried to translate. So you are the guinea pigs for this piece. I haven't performed it for an audience before. I hope Karen likes it. If you want to know the English poem, I'm sure you can have it, you can find a way to read that later. Here's my ASL translation. There are good and bad things about deaf culture, and they are in this piece. This one is called the dining room and the kitchen table. Thank you. But in a poem that I created a few years ago, and I'd like to give you a little bit of the background in its creation. The first paragraph comes from what happened when I was young, and the second is what happened more recently. That second paragraph has to do with the growing movement of deafhood and how deaf people are becoming stronger in their identity as deaf people. I do have some intentional use of handshakes. Don't worry too much about that. It's called a prayer walk.
Patrick Graybill. Wonderful, wasn't it? We have a couple of squirrels sitting right here in front of us. But they're actually being quite entertained tonight because of all of the ASL poetry that they've been able to do. Last but not least, we have two performers prepared for tomorrow night. They're ready for tomorrow night for the flying words, flying hands, flying words project. Theater.
Let me tell you, I'm really touched. Because when I was a college kid, I saw Ella, I saw Patrick. Tom was a counselor. I learned from all these people. I've learned before you started. That's different. I've been really touched by it all. Then I was very motivated. Met Kenny. There was a knock on my door. I opened the door. It looked like Jesus. on a stony ledge overlooking a river, by a stand of trees, is a rocky cliff. And a bullfrog.
And then swims away. Back up on that cliff, a guy strips down. And then leaps down towards the ice cold water, up his legs, goosebumps. Pecker shrivels up. Belly button, tits, teeth, eyeballs, hair. And then he swims away.
I can play with language. Ah! Watch this. I'm going to take language and throw it around the world. Here goes. Language. Let's see, it's 7:30 here, so in New York it should be 11:30, so in England, 6:30 in the morning, language and poetry. Around the world and language. And thank you. Tonight we're going to show you a few things, short things. And we're going to start with something we stole from someone else. Really, we stole this from the South American poet, Pablo Neruda. Yeah? He wrote in Spanish, translated it in English, now we put it into ASL. And I'm going to show his line, and the line from English is, I want to do to you what spring does to the cherry tree.
I want to do to you from the head all the way down. Dancing, dancing breast to breast for one heartbeat. Her hair, neck, line. A cherry tree, a snow-covered cherry tree. The spring sun, it rises up together, coaxing out the buds. A bluebird tugging, coaxing out the fruit.
Wait a minute. Don't clap. This is UCSC, right? This is the sex capital of the world. Am I right? Okay. I'm sorry. I apologize for this misrepresentation of college boys. I'll fix it. Sing out the fruit. They're hiding those children. That's a college boy. Thank you for the feedback. Okay, now it's obvious that we are lousy translators. So we'll show you another one. There's a hearing poet. His name is Gregory Corso. We like his work, so we bought one, translated it, worked on it, and we went off the point, off the point, off the point. His poem and our poem are completely different. In fact, his poem is called In Praise of Neanderthal, and our poem is called Soft Boiled Egg. This poem has a lady who gives birth to a human with a goat head. It's a kind of monster. And there's a dream within a dream within a dream. So good luck to you.
A wooden kitchen table, a gas burner flame, a pot of water bubbling, an old magazine, drifting, born of a dream. I heard a scream. I heard a scream. It entered my ear but grabbed my brain away. The scream. Down halls dark, it was bouncing off walls. Down halls Under the door frame, I could see a little bit of light. So I opened the door, screaming mother, screaming vulva, stretching, pushing out a monster with goat horns, beard, square eyes, legs kicking, and the plastic gloved orderly yanking, spattered, yanking him out, and flinging him to a gurney. He's landing on a gurney besides a nurse dressed all in white from her head to the buttons on her dress. She looks down at the body, at the head, at the torso, at the legs. Amputating legs. Piling amputated legs with feet neatly, like cords of wood, dripping. And then she came for me, awake. Water bubbling. Magazine picture of cave ceilings and cave walls with cave wall drawings, handprints, and a fire, a flame, and animated wall drawings. And the ape man with hair, covered with hair, and with paint, hand covered with paint. Beneath his flame, within his ground, lies a woman and a child. Together, both carefully wrapped and laid to rest. And the ape man with his pleistocene deer, huge set of jaws, long line of teeth, his bare skin rug, his pile of rocks, topped with a human skull, with teeth, no nose, no eyes, hole in the forehead, empty brain cavity. So I turned off the gas and took out the egg. Cracked it. Swallowed it whole. And then I peeked in the eggshell. I could see cave ceilings and cave walls with cave wall drawings and a caveman with wood rubbing sticks, and in the smoke, I could see heroin and bombs and planes flying into planes flying into planes flying into houses in hurricanes, crying in flames, and the egg in my eye. And I screamed.
Wow. Wow, you two are amazing. I'm starting to have visions. Finding myself being lured into her cave, You know, I think I'm gonna go over watch the American Horror Story. Oh, wait, that's Wednesday. Well, I didn't see the street show. What else is there? I know I said last but not least when I introduced you, but there is one more performer. This is something, if you looked at last Wednesday night, you would know the performer I'm speaking of. This is Rosa. How's everyone doing? We good? Wow. My two children are very tired, so I'm going to speed this up and rapidly move for y'all. Jack approached me and asked if I wouldn't mind doing one poem this evening. So I was trying to think of which I would do. And I thought of my first signed poem. One that was Clayton Valley. When I was at the Indiana School for the Deaf, I think I was 15, I had just been to the youth leadership camp. While I was at camp, that's where I discovered the stage. I used to be a shy young thing, hated standing up in front of other people. You know, that was that foreign world that everybody else got involved in, and I had stage fright. But I went to do the youth leadership camp at Mark Wood. Are you familiar with the ASL film producer, Mark Wood? He was our drama teacher. He was not an easy teacher. He didn't care if you felt afraid. He didn't care if your work was not great. He just said, try it anyway. So I did. I stood up, did my piece, contacted my mom. Clayton Valley contacted my mom, asked if I would sign this particular poem of Clayton Valley's for Dawn Sign Press. It was VHS back then, I just wanted to remind you. It was a way of recording our work as we've been prompted to do. And it's called Cocoon Child. I'm doing it live, and I'm not afraid. The thing is, I have to try to remember it. I remember the entire thing. And with that, all right. That's all, folks. That's the end of our festival for this evening. If I could get the performers to stand up, we can give them one final round of applause. We'll be here, Shira. And thank you all. Peace to all of you, your loving spirits. Celebrate the music that you witnessed this evening. Thank you all, and good night. Now we have to be out of the building by 10:30. I don't think I need to tell you that, but in case you don't know, we have to be out at 10:30. If you wouldn't mind collapsing the folding chair, getting them stacked up against the wall somewhere over there, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you all. See you tomorrow. Good night.